Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davich. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. On behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book and DeKalb County Public Library, welcome to another one of our virtual author talks presented through Zoom by the DeKalb Library Foundation. The DeKalb Library Foundation is the fundraising arm of our library system, and they are the entity that paid for the Zoom account that's bringing you these wonderful events since we've had to go online due to the global pandemic since March. They are the fundraising arm of our library system. They provide wonderful programs such as 1,000 Books Before Kindergarten and our Take the Internet Home program. So we thank them this evening for providing us assistance with coming to your home to bring you these wonderful authors that you'll hear this evening. Just a few notes before we begin. If you would like to purchase a copy of Understanding the Short Fiction of Carson McCullers, there will be a link provided in the chat, or you can find it later on the Facebook page for Karis Books and More. Karis Books and More is, of course, an independent bookstore here in Decatur, Georgia, that will ship books to you by mail. They're an independent feminist bookstore. I believe they are the oldest feminist bookstore now in the United States. And we're just so pleased to be able to support our independent booksellers. We encourage you to do that if you don't or aren't able to order from Karis Books. We encourage you to support your local independent bookstore as well as Black-owned businesses during this time. Just another few remarks, that if you'd like to ask a question, you can feel free to either type it in the chat, or if you would like to raise your hand, you can use that feature at the top of your screen, and we will recognize you during the question and answer period. Also, do be sure to keep your microphones on mute. That way that will cut down on background noise and possibly prevent some feedback during our presentation. So tonight we are very, very pleased to have 4 presenters tonight speaking with us. Alison Graham-Bertolini is an Associate Professor of English and Women's Studies at North Dakota State University. She is the first co-editor of Carson McCullers in the 21st Century and the author of Vigilante Women in Contemporary American Fiction. Her work on American women authors has been published in the Journal of Midwest Modern Language Association and the Southern Quarterly. Kayser is an assistant professor of English at the University of Arkansas, where she teaches courses in literature and medical humanities. She is the co-editor of Carson McCullers in the 21st Century, and her work has been published in Midwestern Folklore, Mississippi Quarterly, and Pedagogy. We're also pleased to be joined from Italy this late in the evening or very early morning by Carlos Dews. He is the editor of Illumination in Night Glare. He was supposed to pay us a visit in early May, but due to the pandemic was unable to do so. So we're very, very pleased to have him here this evening. And also Eric Solomon, who is a visiting assistant professor of English at Oxford College at Emory University. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. We're happy to be here. Thanks to everyone for being here or tuning in, I guess is the better way of saying it. Thanks so much to Joe Davich, Allie Wright, with the DeKalb Library, and also Alison and I really want to thank Mercer University Press too, and Marsha Luttrell and Mark Jolly. They have just been wonderful to work with throughout the process of this whole book. And so we're going to share, also thanks to Eric and Carlos for being here, especially at the late hour for Carlos in Italy. We're going to share a little bit tonight. We're going to start by beginning from the preface, reading from the preface, giving you some idea of what some of the essays in the collection are about, and we'll each talk about our own individual essays, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So, though it wouldn't be published until 30 years later, Carson McCullers wrote her first short story, Sucker, circa 1934-35, when she was just 17 years old. The story recounts the devolution of a relationship between 2 adolescent boys as they mature into early adulthood. The story was prescient of themes to which McCullers returned throughout her lifetime, especially the difficulty of establishing and maintaining close relationships with others. McCullers herself wrote, "I suppose my central theme is the theme of spiritual isolation. Certainly, I have always felt alone. Consistently, critics have honed in on this aspect of McCullers' writing, noting that all of her work represents some kind of variation on the one theme of human loneliness. Yet, when we carefully examine the contents of the chapters contained within our collection, it is difficult to understand how for so long we have relegated McCullers and her writing to the singular topic of isolation and loneliness. Instead, what emerges is a picture of an author who is actually very much concerned with the social and political state of the world. Her short fiction includes interrogations of class-based, racial and ableist prejudice, disconcerting portrayals of the social and political anxiety surrounding the Second World War, satirical eviscerations of some of the most oppressive social norms of the mid-20th century, and bold suggestions that lesbian desire, queer relationships, and female authority have a valid place in American culture. Thus, the scholarship collected here requires us to reevaluate earlier considerations of McCullers, especially in the context of her short fiction. McCullers began writing in shorter forms while she was still in high school, and her first memories of writing involved drafting shows and plays that she and her siblings performed in the family's living room in her child home of Columbus, Georgia. She writes, "The repertory was eclectic, running from hashed over movies to Shakespeare and shows I made up and sometimes wrote down in my nickel Big Chief notebooks. But as noted by biographer Virginia Spencer Carr, the fledgling's writer's real awakening evolved at age 15 following a serious illness. McCullers required extended bed rest and a long period of recuperation in a nearby sanitarium, during which time she began to think much more seriously about writing, both for enjoyment, but also as a possible career, in the eventuality that she no longer had the physical stamina to be a concert pianist, which was her original dream. In December 1932, when Carson was still 15 years old, she announced to her best friend, Helen Jackson, that she had determined she would become a writer. McCullers' achievements in short fiction have been, until now, given meager critical attention, although many of her short works were held in high esteem by her contemporaries, and McCullers considered them to be a sustaining part of her career. 6 of her stories were published, some republished, along with the novella The Ballad of the Sad Cafe in 1951 to critical acclaim. Critics, at the time of the text's release, praised her mastery of the short story in addition to her talent as a novelist. During her lifetime, McCullers' short stories were published widely in popular magazines such as The New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, and Vogue, and in 1942 she was recognized with a prestigious O. Henry Prize for her third published story, A Tree, a Rock, a Cloud, which appeared in Harper's Bazaar in November of that year. In 1947, Quick, a weekly news magazine, selected Carson McCullers as, quote, one of the best post-war writers in America. And in 1951, Time magazine declared her one of America's most important contemporary writers. In 1971, 4 years after McCullers' death, her sister, Margarita G. Smith, assembled and published The Mortgage Heart, a collection consisting mostly of McCullers' unpublished writing. More recently, in 2017, McCullers' short fiction was reissued in a Library of America collection, edited by Carlos Dews. The book, McCullers' Stories, Plays, and Other Writings, includes her complete stories, in addition to helpful notes on the texts, and, quote, demonstrates that McCullers was much more than a novelist and that she was engaged in the literary and cultural movements of her time. The collection also contains a reprint of her unfinished autobiography, Illumination and Nightglare, edited by Dews and published in 1999. It also includes her essays and other writings, 5 poems, and 3 plays, including the 1950 stage adaptation of The Member of the Wedding, as it was published in hardcover by New Directions in 1951, the early script and final version of her teleplay, The Sojourner, broadcast in 1953, but never published prior to Deuce Collection, and The Square Root of Wonderful, a play which had a brief unsuccessful run on Broadway in 1957 and was published by Houghton Mifflin in 1958. The recent release of this Library of America volume, with a focus on her short fiction, indicates the continued relevance and value of McCullers' writing in this genre and has provided critics with the opportunity to understand these works in their larger cultural context. It is our hope that with this collection of critical essays from scholars across the world, we will shed further light on McCullers' short fiction, especially through contemporary lenses and analyses, that it will demonstrate connections between her writing in this short fiction genre with her biography and her novels, and ultimately give us a fuller picture of McCullers as more than a novelist. Most importantly, the scholarship in this collection supports the view of McCullers as a writer engaged not only with the literary and cultural movements of her time, but as a writer politically ahead of her time, concerned not just with the failures of human connection, but intent on critiquing oppressive socio-political mores and institutions that may have prevented such relationships. Early in her career, from 1935 to 36, McCullers took creative writing courses at Columbia University in New York City, and then at Washington Square College of NYU. During this period, she wrote many of the short stories with which we are familiar today. At Columbia, she wrote Court in the West 80s, and shortly thereafter, under the tutelage of her noted writing professor, Sylvia Chatfield Bates, she wrote Poldy, Breath from the Sky, The Orphanage, Instant of the Hour After, Like That, and Wunderkind. During this period of intense productivity, Carson McCullers first met Reeves McCullers. The introduction took place in the summer of 1935, when McCullers was home in Columbus for the summer break. Reeves, also an aspiring writer, would soon become her husband. The two shared a volatile, intermittent relationship over the course of nearly 20 years, marrying twice in that period of time.
Hi, before I read a brief section from my chapter that's in the book, I would like to thank Kayser and Alison for the wonderful work they did in editing this volume. It really is a beautiful, beautiful collection, and I'm very proud to be a part of it. The short story Wunderkind became McCullers' first official publication in Story magazine in December 1936. The narrative is about a troubled teenage girl who is considered a musical prodigy, much like McCullers herself when she was an adolescent studying the piano under Mary Tucker, a former concert pianist. McCullers' feelings for Tucker are described by her biographer, Virginia Spencer Carr, as a bond entered into with her, with McCullers' whole spirit. Carr continues, her piano teacher was the fulcrum of her physical and psychic existence. McCullers was devastated when, after 4 years of tutelage, the Tucker family chose to relocate to another state for Tucker's husband's job. McCullers perceived the move as a deep abandonment. McCullers and Tucker saw each other infrequently thereafter, in which Carr calls a period of estrangement of approximately 15 years, until at last McCullers invited the Tuckers to see her play The Member of the Wedding on Broadway in 1950. Recently released archival materials have given scholars perspectives on many aspects of McCullers' life, including her relationship with Tucker. McCullers' one-time psychiatrist and close friend, Dr. Mary Mercer, left numerous materials to Columbus State University upon her death in 2013, including 9 transcripts of McCullers' therapy sessions with Mercer, which were recorded between April and May of 1958. In this chapter in the collection, The Imagination is Truer Than Reality, A New Understanding of McCullers' Wunderkind, I perform a close reading of these archival materials to further illuminate McCullers' relationship with her beloved music teacher. Indeed, my analysis of McCullers' therapy sessions largely confirms that McCullers felt a sexual attraction for her teacher, something that critics including Oliver Evans, Judith Giblin James, Alice Hall Petrie, and Constance Perry have conjectured. The transcripts reveal the complexity of feelings that existed between the two women, feelings that were complicated, as I point out in the essay, by their age difference, by the fact that they were a teacher and a student, and perhaps most significantly, because they were both female and living in an aggressively homophobic society. Ultimately, I argue that these primary sources give us exciting new insights into McCullers and Tucker's relationship and offer new potentials for reading the short story Wonderkind.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, Casey. Thank you for everyone who is listening in tonight. Thanks. Okay, so much of McCullers' short fiction is semi-autobiographical. As Virginia Spencer Carr writes, McCullers transformed her personal reality into fiction. For instance, in 1942, Reeves McCullers, her first husband, from whom she was recently divorced, re-enlisted in the Army. He was deployed to Europe in November 1943 to participate in World War II. McCullers' sister, Margarita G. Smith, notes that about the same time their brother Lamar Smith volunteered for service in the Navy, and that cousins and in-laws and friends of the family were in the service. McCullers' concern for the servicemen was therefore very personal. Carr notes that McCullers felt anguish because of the pain and suffering of hundreds and thousands of tortured, deprived human beings whom she mourned as sinless and helpless. One day, continues Carr, McCullers wrote that even thinking about the war made her almost insane. In 1944, McCullers even tried to find a position as a war correspondent so as to not waste time and blood and brood, and to do something for her fellow man, but this was to no avail. The letters exchanged between McCullers and Reeves during Reeves's deployment make clear that the war, and especially his involvement in the war, left her sickeningly anxious. The war and the politics surrounding American involvement were thus at least a partial impetus for many of the short works from this period, including her stories The Jockey, which was published in 1941, Madame Zelensky and the King of Finland, also from 1941, Correspondence from 1941, and A Tree, a Rock, a Cloud in 1942. All of these stories project a tone of alienation, a search for identity, and as noted by her sister, they reflect the ecclesiastical sense of time and chance and love. In my chapter in this collection, titled Chewed Up and Spit Out, Consuming the Jockey, I argue that the central image of the story The Jockey is that of conspicuous consumption, which McCullers seamlessly blends with the notion of human beings treated as consumable commodities, as is often the case with soldiers during wartime. McCullers wrote the short piece while in residence at the Yaddo Artists Colony in Saratoga Springs, New York in 1941. Her proximity to the horse racing track while at Yaddo sparked her imagination, and she took for the story's setting a bar where she and her fellow artists often drank in the evenings. In the story, aging jockey Bitsy Barlow confronts a horse owner, a horse trainer, and a bookie about the men's indifference to fellow jockey McGuire after he sustains a serious injury during a race. As I note in this chapter, the story, which suggests a queer relationship between the two jockeys, highlights the vast power differential between the working class jockey and the wealthy men. When Bitsy Barlow, in his anger, spits a mouthful of food at the wealthy men, he is both acknowledging and rejecting the commodification of the working class. That is, the frequency with which people are, as the expression goes, chewed up and spit out. Moreover, when he deliberately chooses to insult the wealthy men by calling them libertines, he exposes the ironic and problematic way that most people interpret normality by exposing our tendency to focus on appearances. In this story, then, McCullers ultimately makes symbolic violence visible by casting the body of the jockey as a site where conspicuous consumption by the wealthy results in overt physical harm to the powerless. McCullers' preoccupation and concern over the rise of fascism and anti-Semitism in Europe and ultimately World War II is reflected in many of her short stories. Miho Matsui's chapter in this collection, titled Carson McCullers and Orson Welles, Parables of Fascism, considers the story Untitled Peace alongside her novel The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, discussing both texts in conjunction with the writing of fellow anti-fascist Orson Welles. Kyoko Mogomi's Carson McCullers' psychological narrative in American democracy during World War II focuses specifically on the role of World War II on McCullers' short fiction, primarily the story Madame Zelensky and the King of Finland.
Another significant relationship in McCullers' life was that between her and her mother, Marguerite Smith. Carr explains that as a child, McCullers worshipped Marguerite and was seldom away from her. She basked in the contentment of her mother's praise and beautification, yet at times recoiled from her smothering influence. Certainly, Marguerite doted on McCullers from birth and later during her adulthood. Smith cared repeatedly for both Carson and Reeves when they were ill. After the 1944 death of McCullers' father, Lamar Smith, Marguerite even shared a home with her daughter in Nyack, New York, until Marguerite died in 1955. Yet, despite the significance of McCullers' relationship with her mother, Carson's friends, family, and critics have noted that traditional mothers rarely appear in her works, including in the novel The Heart is a Lonely Hunter and The Member of the Wedding. Judith Giblin James, for example, writes that, as in the novels, mothers are either absent from her stories or portrayed as abnormal. Even McCullers' brother, Lamar Jr., noted that his sister did not often depict meaningful mother-daughter relationships in her fiction, which he felt it was because she did not want to strip herself that bare and show the utter dependency that she felt for her mother. A dependency that she experienced at least in part because of her ongoing ill health. In Liz Mayo's chapter in this collection, Mama Will Be All Right, the complicated Madonna in McCullers' short fiction, she considers the mother figure in McCullers' short stories The Haunted Boy from 1955, A Domestic Dilemma, 1951, and The Sojourner, 1950, all of which depict mothers of male protagonists rather than female protagonists, possibly as a way to deflect the utter dependency that McCullers felt for her own mother. Sarah Marie Horning takes a different and compelling approach to The Haunted Boy in her chapter Understanding McCullers and Mental Illness, The Haunted Boy in the Milledgeville Asylum, analyzing how the story functions as a critique of institutionalization, as well as a, quote, feminist radical critique of the heteronormative entrapment of women in domestic spaces. A rare depiction of a mother and daughter does appear in McCullers' short story Breath from the Sky, first published in 1971 in Red Book, just prior to its inclusion in The Mortgaged Heart. As a child, McCullers suffered from respiratory disorders and as a teenager, rheumatic fever. To complicate matters, doctors were unable to properly diagnose the rheumatic fever for many years, which led McCullers in adulthood to experience heart trouble and a series of strokes. Her third stroke rendered her largely paralyzed on her left side by the age of 30, and she relied on her mother for many activities of daily living. Her heavy drinking and smoking habits also contributed to her ill health, which often led her to extended periods of intense depression. Breath from the Sky is the semi-autobiographical story of a young girl, Constance Lane, who suffers from tuberculosis and is physically and spiritually isolated from her family, especially from her mother. In my chapter, Illness and the Failure of Narrative in McCullers' Breath from the Sky, I examine the story from the perspective of the field of narrative medicine, which acknowledges the value of both patients' and practitioners' narratives in medical education, research, and practice. The dialogue throughout the story highlights Constance's need to speak her illness narrative to her mother and her mother's seemingly disinterested attitude. Looking at this story in conjunction with The Heart is a Lonely Hunter and Clock Without Hands, I argue that in many of McCullers' texts, narrative is essential to characters' success or failure in finding acceptance and healing.
I also want to echo Carlos and saying thank you to Kayser and Alison for this wonderful collection and for including my essay in it. So I also consider the role of illness in McCullers' life in my chapter, The Design is Fugal, the many voices and the long decade composing Clock Without Hands. McCullers' short story, The Pestle, was published first in 1953 in an Italian literary journal, and later that same year in Mademoiselle magazine. And it is a precursor to Clock Without Hands, McCullers' final novel, featuring the same protagonist, J.T. Malone, as he comes to terms with his impending death from leukemia. McCullers wrote The Pestle soon after the first of her debilitating strokes and was forced to dictate much of Clock Without Hands, speaking it aloud instead of recording it on paper because of her disabilities. This final novel has not generally been well reviewed or received by critics, but I would argue that it is intentionally polyphonic and deliberately disharmonic, an assessment that I make in relationship to my consideration of McCullers' early notes on the novel, in which she writes that the design is fugal. I studied drafts, notes, and letters in the archives of the Harry Ransom Center at UT Austin to argue that the pestle and other sections of Clock Without Hands are distinct and disparate parts of a whole. I write, McCullers did not design Clock Without Hands as a whole. It did not first come to us as a whole. We should not consider it as a whole. Ultimately, I argue that the context in which McCullers was writing is crucial to understanding the final novel. The text conveys her fragmented emotional and physical health at the time, and the fugal design reflects her desire to break the Old South symbolic binary ordering, white, black, male, female, straight, gay, segregated, integrated, in favor of an intersectional worldview.
In all, according to Margarita G. Smith, McCullers published 20 short stories, 2 plays, 5 novels, numerous critical pieces and poems, and left behind 128 pages of autobiographical material that eventually became Illumination in Night Glare, the unfinished biography of Carson McCullers. This is a remarkable oeuvre for a person inflicted with a lifetime of debilitating illness and one who died at only 50 years old. February 19th, 2017 marked the 100th anniversary of Carson McCullers' birth, as well as a period of impressive accomplishments related to McCullers and her work. The reinvigorated Carson McCullers Society has established a presence at important national conferences, including the South Atlantic Modern Language Association, known as SAMLA, the American Literature Association, and the Society for the Study of Southern Literature. The Society has overseen the resurrection of the Carson McCullers Society newsletter as an e-news publication written and compiled by committed Society members. McCullers' 100th birthday was commemorated at a conference titled Carson McCullers in the World, which was a gathering of students, scholars, and artists at John Cabot University in Rome. It ran from July 14th through 16th in 2017 under the leadership of Carlos Dews. And finally, scholarship surrounding McCullers' life and work continues to flourish with the help of a small but devoted community of scholars from fields as varied as literature, gender and sexuality studies, and the visual arts. And really, to sum up, we hope that this volume is an important contribution in the ongoing exploration of McCullers' work, using these new critical frames that we've discussed and providing richer ways for all readers to understand her texts. So thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Don't forget, if you all have a question that you would like to ask any one of our panelists, feel free to type it into the chat portion and I can read it aloud for you, or feel free to use the raise your hand feature and you could ask it to our panelists yourself. Allie, do let me know if we have any of those come up. Real quick to get the ball rolling, I guess, this evening. You know, I read The Heart is a Lonely Hunter like most students did as required summer reading, my 10th grade year of high school. And and, I ended up teaching it when I was teaching English. And, I frequently called myself a proselytizer of Carson McCullers because I would just give copies of it away to people who hadn't read it, thinking that this should be required reading for humanity. But what do you think, what is your opinion of why that particular book and why that isolationism maybe strikes such a great chord with readers, and maybe particularly high school readers as well? But to you, what of Carson McCullers' work is maybe one that we should read as well as read The Heart is a Lonely Hunter? Which should maybe we put beside that to teach along with that particular book?
Who wants to begin? Kayser,
I guess I can start. I feel like readers who enjoy The Heart is a Lonely Hunter might also really enjoy, if they haven't read it, The Member of the Wedding, because I feel like it's accessible in the same way and has a similar young female character, grappling with some of the same issues. And Alison can probably speak to this too, because we did an interview not long ago where she mentioned that the first text of McCullers, which was it again, Alison?
The first text I ever read was The Member of the Wedding.
Oh, okay. So I'm contradicting you. But I feel like that reading Reflections in a Golden Eye or Ballad of the Sad Cafe might be a little bit of a different experience for readers. And so I think The Member of the Wedding is a good corollary to Heart. So that would be my answer.
Carlos, you're on mute, but please do chime in.
I give it a shot. Sorry. I want to pick on something that Eric quoted in the passage that he read, that I would argue is the reason you should read, if you're looking for a novel of McCullers to pair with The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, I would at the moment recommend Clock Without Hands. And it's because this word intersectionality that Eric used, because I think one of the things, I just finished teaching The Heart is a Lonely Hunter to a group of advanced students here at my university. And they were so struck by how forward-looking she was to have published this novel in 1940 and to have tried to approach the individual stories of the characters in that novel and the different struggles they're facing in their lives, including the African-American characters that Richard Wright responded very strongly, positively to when the novel was published, and said that it was the first time a white American writer had ever been able to treat with sensitivity African-American people, which was a strong endorsement to come from Richard Wright. But I think at the end of her life as well, and in Clock Without Hands, she sort of narrows the focus more primarily to race and not the broad range of issues she was dealing with in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. But there's something about her tracing all of the South's ills, I will say, that she's engaging in Clock Without Hands and also in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. She traces them to this common source, and it's this idea of this alienation or this lack of connection that people have. And she might explain, that the racism in the South is yet another manifestation of that, as is homophobia, as in misogyny, as in all the other explanations, the ableism that one of the main characters faces in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter as well. So it would be really interesting to see a book from the beginning of her career and the end of her career put side by side with this informing idea of intersectionality as a way to sort of gain access to reading the books. So I stole your idea, Eric, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, take it. No, I echo that, obviously, with Clock Without Hands. I have a sort of attachment to that text in a deep way. And I think that they do pair in many of the ways that you're explaining, Carlos. It's like choosing your children on some level because you love McCullers, and I don't have any kids, so that's probably a bad metaphor. But I love all of the works, but I will just say that for me, I first encountered McCullers by reading Reflections in a Golden Eye. I come at McCullers, I didn't read her in high school. She wasn't taught in my high school in Mississippi. But I am a gay white man from Mississippi, and so I started studying Tennessee Williams at a very young age, who wrote a foreword for Reflections in a Golden Eye, and so that's kind of my journey to McCullers is through Williams. So I have a kind of plug for that particular very short novel that I don't think it pairs with The Heart is a Lonely Hunter quite in the same way that Clock Without Hands would, but I think that it should be more widely read than it is.
Well, I guess because you kind of led into that, Eric, we did have a question about what is your personal favorite work and why?
Joe, do you want us each to answer that?
Oh, yes, please, go right ahead.
I'll jump in on that. If I had to choose, and like Eric said, it's somewhat like choosing among your children or something, but especially those of us who are sort of dedicated as much as most of us are to McCullers, who've contributed to this volume. I have to say The Member of the Wedding is my favorite, and it's less my favorite than the one I respond most strongly to. It's the first work of hers that I read, and it's the one that convinced me that I had a really deep connection with this writer, and led me to read all of her other work. So since it was the first work I read and I had such a strong response to it, I have a special place in my heart for The Member of the Wedding.
I think mine is also The Member of the Wedding, with The Ballad of the Sad Cafe as a close second, just because it's well, first we'll start with The Member of the Wedding, and the reason that I love it so much, I think it just captures that experience of being a young girl approaching adolescence, at the very beginning of adolescence, and sort of pushing back against the restrictive mores of your culture and your society. And I think that so many of us still experience that, unfortunately. It's still very timely in that way. But then as I started reading more McCullers and I moved on to The Ballad of the Sad Cafe, it's so unique. The characters are like no other characters I've ever read before. It features a very tall, almost what you might say is a giantess, Miss Amelia, who runs a cafe, and then her cousin Lyman, who is a dwarf who suffers from dwarfism, appears out of nowhere and tells her that he's her relation, and this very tough, strong woman who doesn't let anyone into her life just sort of falls in love with this guy and brings him into her life, and it gets more complicated from there. It's just a crazy book, but there's so much in it that's profound, and there's so much in it to analyze, as short as it is. So those are my two.
Mine is A Heart is a Lonely Hunter. That's how I first came to McCullers. And I guess one thing that I really have enjoyed in recent years about that text is how contemporary readers and writers are finding it relevant and finding new ways to adapt it. So I'm thinking, I also write a good bit about drama, and also have an essay in our previous collection on, Carson McCullers on the stage, both her own experiences with stage adaptations and plays, but also how other writers have adapted her. And I really enjoyed Rebecca Gilman's, stage adaptation of The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. I had a chance to see that in Little Rock, Arkansas, which was really exciting to me. And then there's also a play by a writer named Sarah Gubbins called FML, How Carson McCullers Saved My Life. And if the FML doesn't really give it away, it's a very kind of contemporary teenage popular culture sort of take on teenagers in this high school reading McCullers. So that's one of the things that I've, even though that was the first text I came to, over the years, I've found it more rich as I've seen, how other people are coming to it and finding it relevant and, ways that mean something unique to them.
Yeah, we actually, a few years ago, we co-sponsored the Big Read with Seven Stages Atlanta, and they did a production of FML, which was very interesting. That was the first time we had an author Skype into our event. So Sarah was sort of like on stage, this giant talking head behind everyone else. It was kind of metaphorical at the same time. I do have another sort of like point of discussion if we wanted to get into. It's like, it seems also that a lot of the authors, especially the Georgia authors like Carson McCullers and Lillian Smith, who had plays or who had written plays, really didn't get a foothold with those on Broadway. Is there something about that? Why, was it maybe they were topically a little too forward thinking? Was Broadway maybe a little too conservative, Rodgers and Hammerstein for these women at that point in time? But it seems that this sort of like group of writers were also writing plays, but they just didn't seem to find that same success in the theatrical world with them.
Casey, you should maybe take this one.
Sure, I can. I'm actually writing a book about Southern plays on stage and some of the potential difficulties with translating the South as a region to the stage. So those are questions I think about, I guess, in a general sense. But with McCullers, the Member of the Wedding was received well, although a lot of critical reviews commented on the fact that the narrative structure was really not sort of well suited for a play format. And so even if the critics liked it, they noted that about the narrative structure. So she may have taken that sort of tendency of hers in terms of writing towards the square root of wonderful, and it just maybe didn't translate well, or it didn't have maybe some of the same compelling characters as are in Member of the Wedding. And I know Lillian Smith adapted Strange Fruit to the stage, and I do think, although I think the stage version was censored, I do think that some of the topics were, relating to miscegenation were, a little risque for the time period, especially for Broadway. And even now, I think that, writers of color, who identify as lesbian, gay, or queer, often have trouble finding success on Broadway. We've done better in terms of, expanding diversity, I think off-Broadway, regionally, but Broadway, there's still a lot of work to be done, I think, in terms of parity. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that does. And I can't wait to read the book, so.
Thank you.
Allie, does anyone have anything else? Has anybody raised their hand, or do we have any more questions in chat for our panelists?
I don't see any.
Yes.
Don't be shy.
Get to bed at a decent hour.
Could I put in a bit of a plug related to the book, if that's okay?
Absolutely.
Probably Alison and Kayser were perhaps too modest to mention it, but their volume that we're talking about tonight is the inaugural volume in a new series that Mercer University Press will be publishing, a Carson McCullers series of books. And I won't be too modest to mention that I'm the editor of the series, and that I'm very happy this is the first volume. It represents the launching of the series very, very well. And if anybody attending or any of the other panelists have any ideas for new books or additional books in the series, you could contact Mercer University Press to propose that we're actively looking for new volumes in the series. But this is a great way to start off the series with this volume on McCullers short fiction.
Thank you for mentioning that, Carlos. We are definitely honored to be the inaugural book in that series. And like I said, you know, we're so grateful to Mercer University Press. It's been such a wonderful experience, and also grateful to all of our contributors in general. The book, you know, would not have been possible without all of their great work, and they made us think more deeply about McCullers with every turn, and we appreciated that. So
that's great. And I don't know if he's attending, but if Mark Jolly is attending tonight, we can all give our thanks to Mark for supporting McCullers as much as he has been lately.
Yes, thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Very much so.
Oh, yep, he is here. Yes, as director of Mercer University Press, that's a great idea, Carlos. This is, in my opinion, a wonderful inaugural volume. My pleasure. Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for attending. Thank you to our 4 panelists for talking to us this evening. We do have some other events coming up. On July 27th, of course, we will do our Poetry Atlanta series with Tara Betts and Alison Joseph. Also, with the Decatur Book Festival, we have one of Jocelyn Jackson's talks with Samir Pandya and Kelly Reed. And then on July 30th, of course, once again, with Mercer University Press, we will be presenting a conversation with Flannery O'Connor and Simone Weil, where fiction and philosophy meet, with authors E. Jane Daring and Ruthann Neckel-Johnson. They have titled their talk for that evening a little different from the title of the book, but you can find tickets for all of those events on Eventbrite, and we encourage you to do so. Don't forget that in the chat, we have the link to order the book. And thank you, of course, to Garcia. This was a very informative and interesting. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Garcia, for joining us. We hope to see you all very, very soon. Thank you so very much, Eric, Carlos, Casey, Alison. It was a wonderful, wonderful time. Much success with the book, and we hope to see you all again very, very soon. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.